Yes. Okay, great. So today I'm going to be talking about how to make communities accessible, particularly focusing on deaf and hard of hearing participants or members. Um, so just like Sarah did, I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am because when you hear a presentation and you see my face, well, what makes me qualified to talk about this topic in particular? So I have my bachelor's and my master's in the education of the deaf and hard of hearing. My bachelor's focused on elementary education, and then my master's focused on secondary education. And upon graduating, I moved into working at a community college in disability services. And there I was focused on mostly just providing support to disabled students who were taking math courses, but I also was involved with the intake process of students came in, they requested accommodations, we looked at all their documentation and determined what was a reasonable accommodation for them and what we could approve. But at the same time, I was also interpreting. There was an ASL professor at the community college who would sometimes have last minute meetings. And while I'm not a certified interpreter, I've been signing for more than half my life at this point. And so they would pull me into meetings to make sure that it was accessible to her. After doing that, I moved into the role that I currently have now, which is with the deaf and hard of hearing virtual academic community. And my role is mostly as a community engagement manager. And we have a couple different online communities. But I also did some online tutoring for students because we provided community, but also academic support. And so I did a lot of online tutoring with deaf students through at what was the time Google Hangouts, but now is Google Meet, and also through Zoom. And then my role is also, because I wear many different hats, I'm a research assistant for a variety of different projects. Um, One of the things that I want to mention is that, you will not see on here and you will not hear from when I'm speaking, I'm clearly not deaf. And so one of the phrases that I learned attending a disability rights event was don't talk about us without us. And so I want to encourage you, while I'm here as a resource, and this is a great place to start, if you're thinking about these things, it's important to connect with the communities that you're attempting to create accessibility for because they know best about their lived experience. So, Sarah talked a little bit about numbers and stuff like that. Deafness in particular is considered a low incidence disability. And I use the term disability because it is considered a disability under the law, but within the deaf community, it is not considered a disability. But the chances are that you have never met a deaf person before, you've never had to interact with them, and you don't really know anything about what it is like to be deaf or to interact with a deaf person. Um, the one thing to keep in mind is that I've interacted with a lot of deaf children, students, and adults, and their experiences are vastly different. Some are native ASL users who come from a deaf family and have signed since birth, and some lip read and speak, some use captions, some have hearing devices, and some don't. A one size fits all approach to accommodating a deaf person is just not going to cut it. They are individuals and need to be treated as such. Um, and going off of that, don't make assumptions about what they need. Ask them. If they say, "Hey, I'm deaf," you could be like, "Hey, do you need an interpreter? Do you need captions? Do you need both?" Um, when you receive a request for an accommodation, it's an opportunity to start a conversation about what that person needs. It's not just a transaction. And so, that person knows best how they need to be accommodated. And as you go through this process, just like Sarah had mentioned, you're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. Don't let that hold you back from trying to accommodate. When you make a mistake, be open to the feedback from that and change, and then go forward. So you may sometimes think to yourself, okay, I've got a request for an interpreter. I'm ready. But the thing is that deafness reflects the diversity of the rest of the world. And so within that community, there are a lot of variations. You may need to also consider things like Braille, screen readers, assistive technology to meet those diverse needs. There's a lot of conversations happening within the deaf community right now about diverse representation from interpreters that a Black participant may want a Black interpreter to best represent their language and their lived experience. So I'm focusing a lot on synchronous resources, and I have a lot of tips for asynchronous resources, but there's just not enough time to talk about that in 15 minutes. So there's some basic things to consider when you are thinking about presenting something synchronously and making sure it's accessible for a deaf person. For many ASL users, deaf individuals, or in general, they will rely very heavily on visual information, but the auditory information is also important to consider. So you want to reduce your background noise, making sure that you're in a quiet location where your voice can be clearly heard if the deaf person is relying on their residual hearing, but also the background noise. So you can see today, I have a very blank background behind me so that it's easy to see me and you're not distracted by somebody walking behind me or things that are happening back here. You want to make sure that you have good lighting, that you can be clearly seen. You're centered in the video and you're looking straight on. You don't want to be the camera looking up or looking down. You want to be able to see your face. Um, I could talk all day about speech to text captions or automatic captions or uh, ASR generated captions, whatever you call them, because one of my other research projects is related to that. The important thing to know is that this is pretty much a very hot topic within the deaf community currently. Many deaf people do not consider auto-generated captions to be full accessibility. And you will notice that if you turn on the captions that there will be errors in it, and it can make it difficult for you to understand what is going on. There have been massive improvements with the technology, and there will be even more changes in the future. But things like internet connection, speaker volume, and especially accent heavily influence the accuracy of those captions that are generated. They're great in a pinch, but in an ideal situation, you should be using a live captionist, a human, to do that. I know that within community engagement, we love things where there's a lot of collaboration and it's not just one person presenting and everybody sitting back and paying attention. But when you're doing things like that, you'll need to pay close attention to turn taking. Hearing people in particular have a tendency to talk over each other, especially when they're in a room together. And so that will interfere with interpreting and captioning, but also an opportunity for the deaf person to take in the information that there's a delay for, and then give their 2 cents and be able to actually engage with that conversation. Um, and then also giving time to process. Just like I mentioned, there's a lag, there's a delay. So when an interpreter is sitting there during your meeting, they are listening to what you're saying, and then they're translating to another language, and then they have to sign it. And that takes time. So when you say things like any questions, and you wait and everybody in the room is quiet and doesn't say anything, and then you decide to move forward, you need to give a little additional time for that processing to happen and for that deaf person to be able to say, actually, I have a question. So when you're working with your accessibility team, you've assembled your interpreter, you've assembled your captionist, and you're ready to go. How do you actually coordinate and work with these individuals? You want to make sure that when you're presenting and when you're talking and you're running meetings, that you're talking to the deaf and hard of hearing person directly. You don't want to say to the interpreter, can you tell them that we're doing blah, blah, blah? Because then you're not connecting with the person. You want to kind of pretend like the interpreter is just on the side and you're engaging with that person like you would if they were hearing. Um, and then it's also really good to share your materials in advance, particularly with interpreting and captioning. If you're going to be using a lot of scientific jargon and vocabulary, it's good for them to know what the topics will be so that they can prepare in advance and have a general idea of what's going to be discussed. Never during your meeting should you ask the interpreter to stop signing or the captionist to stop typing. They are there to provide access to all of the auditory information that your other participants can hear. And so when you ask them to stop, you are no longer providing access to that auditory information. You can always say things like, to everybody in general, what's discussed here is private and will not be discussed out of this group, but you cannot ask a captionist or an interpreter to stop providing their service. You also want to understand their role. They're not there to teach you how to sign or to teach you about how the captionings work. They're just there to provide that access. And so you don't want to ask them to do additional work or put an additional burden on them while they're there. I know that Sarah talked a bit about language, and one of the things that you'll want to keep in mind is to discuss our interpreter or the interpreter. You don't want to say your interpreter because they're there for you too. You don't know how to sign, and so they're also providing you a service to be able to communicate with this deaf individual. Um, any video materials that you're going to share, making sure that they're captioned in advance. This is really beneficial to interpreters and captionists so that they don't have to worry about providing real-time services for those sorts of things. And it makes it easier for the deaf person to just look at the video instead of having to direct their attention to the caption or the interpreter. If you have long meetings, keeping in mind that you have multiple service providers. So it's hard on somebody's body to interpret or to caption. And so if you have a longer meeting, you will have multiple providers who will then swap off probably every 10 minutes or so. And that's something to keep in mind when you are managing things. So just like Sarah had mentioned with creating accessible PowerPoints, something to keep in mind is leaving space for those captions. Sometimes you'll notice if you turn on the captioning with things that it will interfere with the visual aspects that are happening in your PowerPoint. And so an example that I've shown here is the PowerPoint slides, the templates that my university uses. And on every template at the bottom, they say, please do not put content in this space. It's reserved for live captioning because we use live captioning for everything that we do at the university. So you'll want to leave some space below to make sure that they can see everything that you're sharing and also clearly see and read the captions that are on the bottom. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Zoom, and it's kind of hard to talk about Zoom because the best situation would be screen sharing and showing you it. But Zoom has a really nifty feature where they hide Zoom from itself, so I can't show you it. So I took a bunch of pictures so you can get a better idea of where to locate these things. When it comes to captioning, at the bottom of the screen on your taskbar, you will find either a closed caption button that's visible to you if your screen is bigger than mine, or it may be hidden under the more options. And in there, you can adjust the settings. You can make the captions bigger or smaller depending on what you need to make sure that they're readable for the individuals participating. You can also set the language. There are auto-generated captions for 12 different languages. There's Chinese, Dutch, English, French, German, Italian, Japanese, Korean, Portuguese, Russian, Spanish, and Ukrainian. And I'm sure that they probably will add more as time goes on, but that's what they have available currently. So if you will have presenters who are going to be speaking a different language, especially because I know that we have people who are international on this call today, there are some different options available for the automatic generated captions. So you will notice when the captions are turned on for everybody at the top of the screen, it will say a participant has enabled closed captioning who can see this transcript. You can look at it and you can see who is accessing it, but it's just a good clue that, hey, I've turned on the captioning. I use that a lot to make sure that I have set it and that it's on and that it's running. But also within it, you can assign a manual captioner, which we already discussed is the ideal to have a person do it. You can turn on the manual captioning and you can assign somebody. So if you have somebody within your organization who can do the captioning, you can assign them there, which is something that we use a lot at the university because we have staff available to do that. Or you can use a third-party closed captioning service. I don't know a lot about this, but Zoom does have information about how to access and use this service on their support website. So the really new feature, and I say new because it came out in December, is a sign language interpretation view. This is not something that was available before. Before we would have to pin or spotlight the interpreter, but Zoom heard some feedback from people and they decided we're going to add in a feature where you can have a sign language interpreter who floats along the screen and people can move them around as needed. And you can turn it on and off. In order to turn on this feature, you are going to need to have admin access to your Zoom account. Um, so this may be something that you need to figure out within your organization who can turn this on. And more information about exactly how to do that, how to turn on that feature, can be found on the Zoom support website. Um, and so when this is not possible because you don't have admin access, you will have to pin or spotlight the interpreter so that they stay visible when we do things like sharing our screen. Once this feature is turned on and you go to schedule your meeting, if you scroll down, there's going to be an interpretation option where you can type in the emails of the interpreters and assign them before the call even starts. Now, you may say, I don't know who my interpreter is going to be before the meeting starts, and that's fine because Zoom thought of that. And once you go in to start your meeting, there's an option to manage who those interpreters are and change them at the last minute. Along the taskbar, you'll see next to the start screen is the box for interpretation. And from there, you can assign and add interpreters, or you can change them or update things as you need to. Once you've gotten started, then you will, if you turn on the feature, you will see the presenter and then you will see the interpreter in a little box, which is movable. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that this feature is so great and we were so excited about it, but the interpreter is not recorded in Zoom. Which is a real bummer because we want to be able to record the interpreter because full access for asynchronous would be you have captions and you also have an interpreter. But this feature is just not available right now with the software. I reached out to somebody who works in online education and I checked to make sure I wasn't missing anything. And they said, no, this does not currently work in the way that we'd like it to. And the university has reached out to Zoom. So that might change in the future. For resources and more information, I highly recommend the National Deaf Center, which is hosted at the University of Texas. They have a lot of information about the deaf community and also about accommodations and also the legal aspect within the US about accommodating for people. And then also the National Science Foundation has a coordination hub, which is individuals who are invested in increasing diversity in STEM, and particularly related to disability. So if at some point you go, I really need help with this, how can you reach out to me? We have a website and I have two different email addresses and I'm also in the Slack channel, so you can always send me a Slack message too.